So as mentioned, we are going to work on this project and therefore make sure that you have the project set up as instructed in the last course lecture. We actually already have some styling in this project, certainly not the worst one, I think it looks quite decent, but there are things we can do about this project nonetheless. For one, we might want to change the way styles are applied, because at the moment we are using regular CSS with regular CSS selectors, like this class selector. And as I mentioned, this style, even though we're importing it into the course goal list component, is not scoped to that component. It would affect any element on the entire page which has a goal list CSS class. So that's one thing we'll tackle. But we'll start with something different, with setting styles dynamically. And a great example can be found in the course input component. There we are collecting some input by the user, and then we have the add goal button to, well, add a goal. In the moment, we can press that add goal button even if we didn't enter anything, and the result is that we add an empty element here. Now in most applications, we probably want to avoid this. And we don't just want to avoid this, we also want to give the user some feedback about the incorrect input. And that's something we'll build now, and that's something for which we'll need to set styles dynamically. So in course input component, it's the form submit handler where I in the end want to check whether something valid was entered before we trigger that onAddGoal function. So that function we get on this onAddGoal prop, to be precise. For this, we can add a simple if statement here in the form submit handler and check if the entered value, if we trim it, trim is a built-in method that removes excess white space at the beginning or the end, and I use it here to rule out that the user just entered a bunch of blanks. So if we trim this and we check the length, if the length is now equal to 0, we know that the input is essentially empty. In that case, I want to return here. Hence, this line of code will not be executed because function execution stops when you return. And we're done. But the problem now is, now we made sure that we can't add empty goals. I'm hammering this button and it doesn't do anything. This works, however. But even though we added this, we don't give the user any feedback. And that's exactly where we now need our styling. I want to add a red border and a slightly red background color to that input, and also a red color to that label if the user entered something invalid here. Now, how can we achieve this? Well, we can manage an extra piece of state here, and that state could be an indicator for whether the user submitted and entered something valid or not. So it's a true or false choice, and therefore we'll be working with a Boolean. And initially, let's say, we trust the user. So initially we set this to true, and I'll name this state is valid, and the updating function set is valid. Now, as long as this is true, I consider the input as valid. If we make it into this if block, though, I know it's invalid, and therefore we can call set is valid and set this to false, because what the user entered and submitted definitely is not valid. Now, if this is false, I want to apply the styles I just said. And the easiest way of doing that is to add the inline style here to the label, for example. And as you learned, you need to set an object there. The inline style prop here wants an object as a value. And in that object, you target the different CSS style props in JavaScript that you can set for this element, for this component. So for example, here, the color property is available, and we could set this to red. But of course, we don't always want to set this to red, but only if the input is invalid. So I check if not is valid, and if that's the case, I set this to red. Otherwise, I set this to black, for example, which is the default color. And that should allow us to dynamically set this to a red color. We use the style prop, we pass an object to it as demanded, but we dynamically change the value that's fed into the color property in that style object. And therefore now if we save this and we go back, if I submit this without entering anything, you see that label becomes red. Currently we then never reset it, but that's a first important step. Now we need to also change the border and background color of this input, and that's definitely something you can try on your own. Here's a short break which you can take to pause the video. Thereafter, we'll implement it together. Were you successful? Well, adding it shouldn't be too hard. We add the style prop again, pass in an object because that's what it wants. And now we can set the border color, and that's the only tricky thing. It's border color written like this because we're in JavaScript here, not in a CSS file, and therefore we need to use the JavaScript property name for that CSS property, and that happens to be the camel case version of the CSS property name, hence border color written like this. And I also want to set this to red if this is invalid. So the value is exactly the same as up here. And therefore, of course, we could also refactor this into a separate variable. For the moment, since I only need it in these two places, I'll keep it like this. And we also need a background. And here again, I check if this is invalid, in which case I colored it red, otherwise black. Now this red might actually be a bit too much, and therefore maybe here we want to use something else. I think salmon should be good. And that should not be black but transparent, because of course I don't want a black background in the input, I want a transparent one. With that, if we save this, now if I click add goal, it's colored like this. Now it's also never reset at the moment, but at least we got the conditional styling. And of course you can play around with the exact color values to, well, get a different styling. Now, two notes. For one, of course, we want to reset this eventually. And second, I'm not 100% happy with that, because with this approach we currently have here, we always set inline styles, which of course have the highest priority in CSS. So you override all other styles with that. Now actually I'm happy with the default styles we set up in course input. For example, for the input, I have a border color of this light grayish color here. Now, needless to say, we could set this up here as well. I could reset this to this grayish color, for example, instead of black, so that when we reset it, we go back to this predefined color we have in the CSS file. But still, we have some duplication here. We got a base color scheme here in the CSS file, and then we override this with inline styles just because we want to conditionally set some specific styles if the input is invalid. And that's why I'm not 100% happy with those inline styles. So let's now quickly work on the reset functionality before I then show you an alternative to setting dynamic styles with inline styles. Now, to work on that reset functionality though, all we need to do is go to the place where we react to every keystroke. And in the end, we just need to check if event target value, which is the entered text, if that is now basically valid. So if we trim it and get the length, if the length is greater than 0, if it is, we know the input is valid, and then we could call set is valid and set this to true again. And here, of course, we need a dot. And with that, if we go back, if I submit this, this is red, but if I start typing, you see it's no longer invalid. But if I submit it in an invalid form, it of course still becomes red. So that's working, but as I mentioned, for the reasons I mentioned, I'm not 100% happy with the inline styles because they take a very high priority, and you can certainly always find ways of making it work, but I personally would prefer to not set inline styles. So let's have a look at an alternative.